I'm Zoe Walker, and I thought I would start by just saying a little bit about my background. So I've been a fellow in philosophy at Trinity for the past year, which has involved teaching various philosophy papers to undergrads, and then I've also been carrying out some of my own research. So I'm very interested in the kind of relationship between art and morality, and of course that's going to be important for today's talk. Before Trinity, I did my PhD at Cambridge University, and that was on the ethics of humour. So I was interested in things like what your sense of humour says about you, and how when people make a joke, they're often not just kidding, but they might be doing other things with their words as well. Before that, I had a job writing puzzles for puzzle books, so that was a lot of fun. And before that, I did my undergrad in philosophy at Cambridge. So that was where I first became interested in these kind of questions about art and morality. So if in the Q&A you want to ask me about any of that, please do. Okay, so in today's talk, as you've seen from the title, we're going to be looking at this question: does immorality make artworks worse as artworks? And I think
Zoe, can I just interrupt briefly?
Oh, yeah.
And I'm sorry, this is the last time I'll do this, but just to say that a Slido plug. If you'd like to ask Zoe questions and also take part in polls, if you go to slido.com, you'll find an event. It asks you for a code. Just put TBC10 in there, and you'll see that our event, Trinity Beyond the Classroom Talk 10, is there. So I'm looking at that and taking questions as well. Sorry, Zoe, back to you.
No worries. Okay, so as I said, we're considering, does immorality make artworks worse as artworks? And I think before we properly get into that question, it's going to be useful for us to say a little bit about what do I mean by artworks here, and also what do I mean by immorality, so that we can see what the kind of scope of the question is. So first off, what do I have in mind when I say artworks? I think the first thing that might come to your mind when you hear that is fine art. So that'll be things like paintings or sculptures. And I definitely want to include those in my discussion of artworks. But I also want to include lots of other forms of art. So for example, books, films, or TV shows. So when you're thinking about this question and how immorality affects art, I want you to think about all these kinds of artworks. If there's a film you've seen that you thought was immoral, that's going to be relevant to this discussion. Okay, and then I think the second thing we want to clarify is what do I mean by immorality here? Because I think it might not be obvious straight away how an artwork is the kind of thing that could be immoral at all. Isn't that really a thing that people are, for example? Okay, so I think the first thing that might occur to you when you hear immorality and artworks is the idea that the artist is immoral. So maybe what you think I mean is an artwork is immoral if the person that made it is immoral. And I definitely think there's a kind of interesting question about how we should interact with artworks when we know that their creators have done immoral things. But that's not going to be our focus today. Put a little X there. So instead, we're going to be focusing on the artworks themselves rather than kind of talking about the people that make them. Okay, so what else might I mean by immoral artworks? Another thing that might occur to you is maybe when there's been something immoral in the creation of an artwork. So for example, there are lots of films where animals are harmed in the making of a film, or maybe you hear about actors getting treated really badly. And again, I think there are some moral questions to be asked here, but what we're going to focus on today is the kind of finished product, the final artwork, rather than looking at kind of what comes before and how the work is created. Okay, so what else could I mean by immoral artworks here? Well, another thing that might come to mind is the effects that our artwork has on its audience, right? So, for example, people often talk about violent video games making people act violently. So we might think an artwork is immoral if it has these kind of bad effects in the real world on its audience or something. And I would say that this is indeed a way in which a work can be immoral that is kind of interesting and worth studying. So in my work, I am interested in the effects that comedy has on its audience, for instance. But in our discussion today, what we're interested in is what affects how kind of artistically good an artwork is. And that's in our kind of title question. And I think it would be kind of odd to say that the effects or the consequences of the artwork determine how good an artwork is, because it seems as though people could respond to the work in very kind of odd and unreasonable ways that come out of some kind of misunderstanding of the work. So maybe you can imagine that a billionaire watches the Hunger Games and they think, oh, that's a great idea, and they create a real life Hunger Games. And obviously that would have lots of very bad consequences. But it doesn't seem right to say that that means the Hunger Games is worse or is immoral in some way, because it seems like the billionaire has just really misunderstood the point of the Hunger Games. They haven't really responded to it in a kind of reasonable way. And so it's not really fair to blame the Hunger Games for this strange reaction. So I'm not going to focus on the effects of artworks today, even though I think, there's another discussion to be had about those. So what we really want to focus on is immorality in the work itself. So maybe the next thing that would occur to you is, okay, is an artwork immoral when it depicts immorality? So is a painting immoral if it shows something immoral happening, for example? And this time we're getting quite close to what I mean, but again, this isn't quite right, because often artworks depict immoral events in order to show how immoral they are and to kind of condemn those works. So something like The Boy in Striped Pajamas is a book and also a film that depicts the Holocaust. But I think it would be odd to say that the book is immoral for depicting those events, because the point of the book is to convey the horror of the Holocaust and to condemn it. So it'd be odd to say that that made it immoral just because it showed something immoral. So instead, this points us to what we do mean by immoral. We're interested in artworks that seem to kind of endorse something immoral, or in other words, have some kind of immoral message. So one classic example that is often used in this kind of debate is this Nazi propaganda film, Triumph of the Will. Just like The Boy in Striped Pajamas, Triumph of the Will depicts Nazis, it's about Nazis, but whilst Boy in Striped Pajamas kind of condemns the Nazis, Triumph of the Will endorses and celebrates them. So in that sense, it's an immoral film, right? Because it's endorsing this immorality, whereas Boy in Striped Pajamas is just showing us the immorality, but it's condemning it. So this is the kind of immorality that we're interested in today. Okay, so again, our question is, can artworks be worse as art because they're immoral? So if an artwork has an immoral message, like this pro-Nazi message of the film Triumph of the Will, or you might have seen a film that you thought was a bit sexist, for example, does that make it a worse piece of art? Or would we say that the morality of the film is kind of separate from how good it is as a film? It's kind of how artistically good it is. So that's the kind of question that we're interested in today. And as you can imagine, there are a number of possible answers that we could give to this question. So I think before we get into the kind of nitty-gritty of what are the different arguments that people have made in this debate, it might be helpful to have a sort of overview of the possible answers that you might give to this question, and then we can decide which ones we like best. Okay, so in answering this question, the first thing we have to ask is, can artworks be immoral? So I've just given you an example of an artwork that I think is immoral, but there are some people who deny that artworks are the kind of thing that can be immoral at all. So they would answer no to this question. So Oscar Wilde, for example, once said, "There is no such thing as a moral or an immoral book. Books are well written or badly written, that is all." So that sums up this kind of view that trying to say a book is moral or immoral is just the wrong way of thinking about books. And if you agree with this Oscar Wilde view, then that makes you a radical autonomist. So that's our first answer to this question, radical autonomism. And it's called that because it holds that artistic value and moral value are just completely autonomous from each other, completely separate. So separate that artworks can't even have a moral value at all. So if you answer no to the question, can artworks be immoral? That makes you a radical autonomist. But of course, most people, many people, all these other views would answer yes to that first question. They'd say, yes, artworks can indeed be immoral. And then the next question is whether or not this affects how good the artwork is as a piece of art. So if you think, yes, they can be immoral, a film could be immoral, but that doesn't affect how good it is as a film. So you answer no to this question, can immorality make them worse? That makes you a moderate autonomist. And you can see where that name comes from because, again, you think that artistic value and moral value are quite separate, but they're not quite as separate as the radical autonomist thinks they are, because an artwork still can be immoral. That's just separate from how good it is as an artwork. On the other hand, you might think immorality can make artworks worse. So you answer yes to that question. Artworks can be immoral and it can make them worse. So that gives us a kind of final question, which is, okay, if immorality can make artworks worse, does it always make them worse or only sometimes? So you might think that any time a work has something immoral, it is thereby a worse work. Or you might think sometimes it makes it worse, but in other cases, immorality doesn't affect how good it is. So if you think it doesn't always make a work worse, that makes you a moderate moralist. So you can see how there's a sort of moderate view. We sort of say sometimes it makes it worse, but not always. Whereas if you think it always makes an artwork worse, that makes you an ethicist. And don't worry too much about remembering the names of these positions. I'll kind of explain again what they all are as we go through. But that's just to give you a sense of these four possible answers to today's question. So one answer, artworks can't be immoral at all. That's the radical autonomist. The second answer is artworks can be immoral, but it doesn't affect how good they are as art. So that's the moderate autonomist. Third answer, immorality sometimes makes an artwork worse. That's the moderate moralist. And finally, immorality always makes an artwork worse as art. And that's the ethicist. So at this point, I'd like to invite you to take part in a poll so we can see, before we've looked at the arguments, which of these views do you find appealing? Which one do you agree with just as your first instinct?
Okay, just bear with me, please, while I just activate said poll. So attendees, if you could go to slido.com, please, and it asks you for an event code. That's where you can also ask questions tonight. And you will see a poll there as well on the poll. And as Zoe asks, at the start of this topic, which option best represents your thoughts on the question, does immorality make artworks worse as art? And I will just take over. Thank you for your participation. It's always lovely to see when people, a little bar across the screen there, that the Slido's working. Here we go. Artworks can be immoral, but it doesn't affect how good they are as artworks, which, as Zoe's told us, is moderate autonomism. And we'll come back to Zoe's screen now. Here we are. Rose, we have your hand up. If you'd like to just pop me a question or message on the Slido Q&A, please, because we can't have chat on this Teams. So if you go to slido.com, TBC10 is the event code. If you have a message for me, sorry, I can see your hand raised, but I can't come to you because we don't have a chat. Okay, back to Zoe.
Okay, great. So just find where we were again in the PowerPoint. So we've now seen our 4 positions that we're going to be looking at. There. Radical autonomism, moderate autonomism, moderate moralism, and ethicism. And we've seen from the poll that so far you're quite sympathetic to the moderate autonomist view. So you like the idea that artworks can be immoral, but you think that doesn't affect how good they are as artworks. So we're going to actually consider 3 arguments, all of which disagree with that view. And then we'll see if any of them convince you. Okay, so we'll start with an argument for radical autonomism. So for the view that artworks can't actually be moral or immoral at all, which is called the common denominator argument, and it will soon become obvious why. And I'm a philosopher, and what we do in philosophy with these things is we lay out the claims that the argument depends on, and then we kind of evaluate, are these claims true? And if they're all true, then the argument goes through, we're convinced. But usually they're not all true, and then we don't agree with the argument. Okay, so let's have a look at this first argument, which is for radical autonomism. So the first claim of this argument is that moral evaluation is not applicable to all art. It's not applicable to every kind of artwork. And I think we can see the appeal of this kind of claim if we think about artworks like these ones that I have on the slide here. So at the bottom here, we've got this Jackson Pollock painting, which is called Blue Poles. It's very abstract. And, you know, you might be thinking, what is this painting about? What's the point of it? Seems like the right kind of thing to be thinking. And I think it would seem very odd to say, given how abstract this is, that this painting has some kind of moral or immoral message, right? So moral evaluation just looks kind of like the wrong thing to do with this artwork. And similarly, here we've got this Barbara Hepworth sculpture, which is called Two Forms. Again, it seems like there's a lot of room for interpretation, and it seems kind of odd to say that this sculpture has some kind of moral message that we can assess as either good moral or bad immoral. And finally up here I've got this musical piece, John Cage's 4 minutes and 33 seconds, which you can probably see from the picture is in fact 4 minutes and 33 seconds of silence. So there is no music there. And we might wonder, what is the point of this piece? What was Cage trying to do here? But I think, again, it seems odd to try and make some kind of moral assessment of this work. So all of these 3 artworks support this first claim of the radical autonomist argument. They all say it looks like moral evaluation isn't going to be applicable in every case. Then the second claim of the argument says any standard for evaluating art must be applicable to all art. And the thought behind this claim is that, you know, art is this kind of unique thing that we do, unique form of activity that has its own purposes, its own standards of evaluation. Whatever makes something an artwork is shared by all artworks. And so any standard of assessment of that artwork should also be shared by all artworks. So that's the kind of thinking that is going on in that claim. And then if we agree with both of these claims, of course, it's going to follow that moral evaluation cannot be a standard for evaluating art, because as we've seen, it doesn't apply to all art. So if we only accept standards that apply to all art, we don't accept moral evaluation. And in other words, that is the radical autonomous claim, right? That artworks just aren't the kind of thing that can be moral or immoral. Okay, so that's the argument. Now we get our philosophy hats on and we think, how plausible are the claims that this argument relies on? And I think with the first claim, we have seen some examples that do seem to support it quite well. We've seen some good examples of artworks that don't seem to be morally evaluable. Maybe you could try and argue that actually in all of these cases there's some kind of message and it is moral, but that looks like it's going to be a tricky way to rebut this argument. So I think instead we want to focus on that second claim, this claim that any standard for evaluating art must be applicable to all art. And I imagine when you heard this argument, you thought, not sure about that, and most people do. So I think this is the claim that we're going to reject. So I think even if we have one standard that can be used to assess all of art, and that in itself is kind of a controversial claim, it doesn't follow from that different genres of art can't also have their own standards. So we could still have standards for assessing books or films or something, and maybe moral evaluation is relevant as one of those, even if it's not a standard that applies to everything. So I think it looks as though this argument is not going to succeed. The radical autonomist is going to have to try something else if they want to convince us. Okay, so now let's look at another argument, and this time we're going to go in quite a different direction. We're going to see about an argument for ethicism. So again, this is a position that you didn't agree with originally. We'll see if this convinces you. So ethicism is the view that any kind of immorality in an artwork makes it worse as an artwork. And it draws on the idea of beauty and ugliness to make this point. Okay, so the first claim of this argument is that immorality always makes an artwork ugly. And I think there's something on the face of it kind of plausible about this. So we sometimes talk about moral things being beautiful, the ugliness of immorality. We maybe think typically there's something compelling or pleasing about morality and something repellent about immorality. So maybe there's something kind of plausible about this. Then the second claim of the argument says, well, ugliness always makes artwork worse as art. And again, maybe that sounds kind of plausible at first. So we think usually we talk about beauty and aesthetic pleasure as being things that make artworks really good. And so if an artwork lacks those and it's ugly, we might think this makes the artwork worse as a result. And of course, if both of these things are true, it's going to follow that immorality always makes an artwork worse as art, which of course is the ethicist claim. Okay, so now we get into our assessing how plausible is this argument. I think in this case, we can probably try and criticize both of these claims. So start with the first one, which says immorality always makes an artwork ugly. I think while this is sometimes true, it's also the case that sometimes people find immorality quite compelling, right? So for example, you think of the film Goodfellas, if you've seen that. The characters of, oh, yes. Oh.
Sorry, there's thousands of films out there. #1 film of all time for me. Sorry, you didn't need that audience participation.
No, that's okay. I'm glad that you think so. That helps my case, I think, or helps the ethicist. Yeah, helps my critical case. So a lot of people find, even though the characters are doing very immoral things throughout the film, there's something very compelling and exciting about this. We're not repelled by what they're doing. We actually really enjoy it. And if that's true, it seems like, at least if we understand ugliness quite straightforwardly, it doesn't look as though this kind of immorality is ugly in this case, in which case it's not going to be a defect of the work. And I think maybe we could also question claim 2, ugliness always makes an artwork worse as art. So I think in a lot of cases, what we think is good about an artwork is its ability to kind of depict the ugliness of the real world and human life in this very powerful and accurate way. So for instance, if we take kind of war films or poems or paintings about war, usually when we think those are good, it's because they kind of successfully and powerfully convey the horrors of war, or in other words, the kind of ugliness of it. So I think in these cases, ugliness is, if anything, a merit rather than a flaw of the work. So again, possibly we can reject this claim. And it looks like the ethicist is going to have to try something else if they want to convince us of their position. Okay, and let's look at one final argument then. And this time it's an argument for moderate moralism. So that was the position that immorality sometimes makes an artwork worse, but not necessarily. And I think this one's a little bit subtler than the first two, so maybe you might find it more persuasive. Let's see. Okay, so the first claim of this argument is that artworks invite emotional responses from their audiences. And what the claim has in mind, take a horror film like Get Out, it invites us to feel scared. Or similarly, a comedy might invite us to feel amused, or a tragedy invites us to feel sad. So that's what that claim means. It sounds quite plausible. Then the second claim of the argument is that if audiences don't experience the invited responses, then the artwork is artistically flawed. And again, there's something plausible about this. So if there's a horror film and it doesn't make us feel scared, or a comedy that doesn't make us laugh, or I don't know if you've seen The Room, but a tragedy that doesn't make us feel sad, then this looks like it's a flaw of the artwork. There's something bad about the artwork there. Most people consider The Room to be one of the worst films of all time, and I take it that at least in part that's because it's a tragedy, but no one finds it sad. Everyone finds it very silly and funny. Okay, and then the final claim of the argument is that sometimes immorality can prevent audiences from experiencing the invited responses. So this is how immorality comes into the picture. And I think that a good kind of example for this claim is a film that came out in 2020 called I Care a Lot, but I'll explain in case you haven't seen it what it's about. So the main character in this film is a sort of charismatic scammer played by Rosamund Pike, as you can see in the picture. And she has this sort of care home that she uses to steal elderly people's savings. That's her kind of grift. And at various points in the film, we're meant to kind of feel sorry for her or to empathize with her in some way. But lots of people who saw this film found that they just couldn't empathize with her and couldn't feel sorry for her because she was so immoral. Like what she was doing was so horrible that you couldn't have the responses that the film invited you to have. And so in that sense, the immorality of the film has kind of blocked the responses that you were supposed to have. And so if that's true, if all these claims are true, it's going to follow that sometimes immorality makes artworks artistically flawed. Or in other words, moderate moralism is true, because the claim is just that immorality sometimes makes artworks worse. And I think a lot about this argument is very convincing. I think it makes some good observations about our engagement with artworks and how immorality can sometimes block that engagement. Maybe one place that we might want to push back on or hear a little bit more from the moderate moralist is this claim too about the audience's responses to artworks. So you might remember I said earlier in the talk that maybe there's something problematic about saying the effects an artwork has determine how good it is, because some people might just respond in a really unreasonable way or something like that. And a kind of related problem is which audience is it that matters? So if I watch I Care a Lot and I find myself able to empathize with the main character, but you don't, whose reaction matters? Is the work flawed because you didn't empathize, or is it not because I did empathize? So I think these are questions the moderate moralist might be able to answer, but we need to pose them and put them out there. Okay, so we've now seen these kind of three different arguments, discussed a couple of problems with them, maybe they can be responded to. And I should say this is only, so we've had the common denominator argument, moral beauty argument, and the uptake argument. this is only a kind of small sample of this much bigger debate that is going on, but hopefully I've given you a taste of the kind of things that these views have said. So why don't we end by taking our poll again, just see if anyone has changed their minds. Are you persuaded, especially by this last argument, the uptake argument?
And we've also got some cracking questions to follow as well. So if you go to the poll tab, wow, these questions are amazing. Poll tab, let's see what you reckon after the argument in terms of, and I shall check if we have any responses. Here we go. Oh, hello. Oh.
So we've stuck with the moderate autonomism.
It was part of you hoping that would have a mind change there, Zoe.
Well, I thought that if it was going to happen at all, it would be with that last argument. I think that's the most persuasive of the three that I've discussed.
Okay, some cracking questions, which I'm gonna. There's a really big one. Which I'm gonna leave to last. Wow, so we've got three questions. You've chosen films as your artworks. Do you think they're more easy to relate to than, for example, pictures on a wall?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think, I guess there are a few reasons why I've chosen films. I think you're right about the ease of relation with films. I think I like to talk about films because most people have watched quite a few films and kind of have these examples in mind. So I think they tend to be, if I'm trying to give an example that everyone's familiar with, films are often an easier one. I guess maybe another thing about paintings is, as we saw with the Pollock painting, a lot of paintings don't seem kind of morally to have kind of moral features. And there certainly are some that do, but that might be a reason why I think films and kind of narrative art almost always has this moral dimension. So that's another reason. But I think
so visceral response as well, maybe. I mean, the fact that I couldn't control myself, that you got my favorite ever film there, and I didn't even know you were going to be talking about films or that particular film.
Yeah, I guess people are more maybe often more excited by films. I think, I guess I just wouldn't want to assume knowledge of all paintings because I think people are less likely to know them. But yeah, that's part of it as well, I think.
What about your journey, I suppose? How did you come to be interested in artworks as part of studying philosophy? Was there a particular trigger, like something you saw, or was it during your philosophy degree? I think you mentioned you did your philosophy degree at Cambridge.
Yeah, that's a good question. So I would say my interest in artworks more broadly was just came from studying an aesthetics paper as part of my philosophy degree. So that was like my favorite paper that I studied as an undergrad. And since then, I've just always been interested in these questions. And then with my PhD, which is when I became interested in comedy in particular, that was the result of this film night we had when I was at the start of my PhD. We all watched the film Superbad. And I found it very morally interesting, I suppose. I had a lot to say about it. And it was actually that film that sparked my interest in wanting to talk about comedy. I just thought it was such a rich topic. So obviously I thought that film was immoral in some ways, but also I owe it a lot because it gave me lots of ideas.
I didn't know it'd been so thought-provoking as a film. That's I haven't seen it, I must clarify. And then a big one for the last 3 minutes, if I may. This is really interesting question, I think. As emotions are subjective and experienced differently by each individual, wouldn't the uptake argument suggest every artwork is flawed, as it's impossible to guarantee everything will be interpreted in the same way by at least one person?
I think that's a really good question. I think you've kind of hit upon the kind of potentially big problem with the uptake argument there. So I guess one way the moderate moralist could respond to your question is to say that artistic value is subjective. So all we can say is that artworks are good for a certain person or something like that. But I think some moderate moralists, that's not really the route they'd want to go. So instead, something that they've, so there's this philosopher called Noel Carroll, who's a big proponent of moderate moralism. he says what matters is the reactions of a kind of morally ideal audience. So we don't base our judgment of how good the artwork is on real, actual audiences' responses, but on how a kind of morally ideal person would respond to the film. So that's a way to get around the subjectivity, but I think you might well just say, well, why should we care about the morally ideal audience and not other audiences? Aren't you just kind of now assuming that morality has something to do with it when we might want to deny that? So yeah, I think what your question brings out this kind of problem for the uptake argument, which there are a few ways you could go to respond to it, but I think you're right that maybe none of those ways are fully satisfying.
Absolutely brilliant questions, if I may say so, and thank you so much, Zoe, for the way you've approached them. We're going to have to head off now because we're just being sent out of the building as it happens in terms of hosting. So we really have got quite a hard cut off tonight. I'd love us to spend longer discussing this. Zoe, thank you so much for your enthusiasm. An absolutely fascinating topic, and one which has probably inspired as many further follow-on questions with those who've joined us tonight, whether it's live or seeing this on the college YouTube channel. So final words to you, but a massive thanks from us at Trinity College, Oxford. Over to you, Zoe.
Great. Yeah, thanks very much for all the questions. That was really interesting. And I guess if you want to ask me more or you want to find out more online, you should be able to find me and also find this topic. If you search art and morality or something like that, there'll be lots of information online. So I hope you find that interesting.
Thank you very much once again. Cheerio. Good night.